Hello everybody and welcome to another macroeconomics video. Today we're going to be talking about demand and supply, but in financial markets. So if you've been watching the recent videos, you know we've talked about demand and supply just generally. We talked about it in terms of labor markets in 4.1, and now we're going to talk about it very quickly in terms of financial markets. In order to start thinking about supply and demand in financial markets, we have to start defining what is demand and what is supply in financial markets, because it's different than the other two. So we have here that savings are going to be the supply for financial capital, whereas borrowing will be the demand. So the supply are households and firms and governments that are saving money. Borrowing is also similar actors, right? We're going to have households, we're going to have firms, and we're going to have governments that are borrowing, and they're going to be demanding the financial capital for various reasons, right? Households might demand the financial capital to finance a house or finance a boat or finance a car purchase, some big ticket purchase, whereas businesses usually finance the expansion of their particular business or an expansion of a physical variety in terms of a new building or franchising or so on and so forth. So a lot of those things require financial capital. So how do we very loosely model what happens in terms of financial markets? How do we use our supply and demand model to do that? Let's go ahead and start. So as always, we start with an L-shaped curve with, instead of price now, I just do that automatically, but instead of price over here, we're going to have the interest rate. The interest rate. Which is the quote-unquote price of borrowing this financial capital. The other way of thinking about this is it is the rate of return on an investment. So we're going to have the interest rate on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we're going to have the quantity of financial capital. So we'll just say the quantity of, and we'll write it out, financial capital. So we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve, which represents the borrowing. We're going to have an upward sloping supply curve, which represents the supply or the savings. And where those meet is going to represent some equilibrium interest rate. And it's going to represent some equilibrium quantity. So we call this I star Q star. And to use the examples from the book, it finds that when we're talking about credit cards, the equilibrium interest rate is 15%. That's how much credit card companies should charge in order to clear the market so that there's not an excess supply or excess or a shortage of financial capital. And at 15%, there's going to be 600 billion US dollars loaned and borrowed. Now, we can ask ourselves similar questions that we do before. What if the interest rate was up here at, 21%, right? Well, the book tells us that at 21%, then we're going to have a quantity supplied, at 21%, a lot of people are going to want to save money, right? So the quantity supplied at 21% is going to be something like 750 billion, whereas the quantity demanded at that same 21% would be only 480 billion, right? So a lot fewer people compared to the quantity supplied, right? A lot fewer people would be demanding those financial resources because the price is high. So maybe they would put off buying that home, put off financing that car, so on and so forth. This would also disincentivize companies from investing in new projects because essentially all these projects have a certain rate of return, an estimated rate of return. And the more expensive financial capital is, the less appealing projects are with lower rates of return, right? And sometimes they just become non-viable. In a different era, when money is very cheap, and you can borrow lots of money at 5% interest rate, a project might be viable compared to if the interest rate is 15%, it's not going to be viable. Or if it's 21%, it's not going to be viable, right? To keep with that previous example. Likewise, if the interest rate was too low compared to the current supply and demand, right? If it was at somewhere like 13%, then we would have a demand of 700 billion, whereas we would only have a supply of 510 billion. So there would be a shortage of financial capital here because the interest rate is artificially low compared to the demand and supply factors. So the next and last part that we're going to talk about in terms of section 4.2 is looking at a price ceiling in terms of financial markets. So we have usury laws, right? Usury laws are laws that impose an upper limit or a maximum interest rate lenders can charge. And so in this particular example, right, this would be a price ceiling. So a maximum that's actually binding is going to be a price ceiling. And at this particular interest rate, C, or to use the same terminology we were using before, IC, we would have a quantity supplied of financial capital that is perpetually lower than the quantity demanded. And so by imposing a price ceiling, by imposing usury laws, you are actually the government is creating a shortage of financial capital in the market, in all the markets for households, the markets for firms, so on and so forth. All right, there's a great example in the book which talks about the macroeconomy and a very relevant example about what happens if the foreign investors start to find United States investments, particularly United States treasuries, less appealing, what that will do to interest rates. So I want you to think about that on your own in terms of how would that impact, which one of these would that impact if foreign investors started to get spooked and stopped investing as much, in terms of they started to get scared and they stopped investing as much in United States financial markets. What would that do? Would that impact the supply curve? Would that impact the demand curve? And then what would be the predicted outcome in terms of interest rate and the quantity of financial capital? Go ahead and do that on your own, and then look through the book and do the little quiz that I will have for you guys, and have a great weekend.